not sure how long I'm going to pursue it on this tape, but let's do it this way. This is, for those watching the tape, this is 1991, one of our more popular years. And this follows, believe it or not, 1891, which was last night, and at which time we were also meeting and making a tape. Now here's what I'm going to do, sort of. And this is, of course, of only great interest to those who were here last night, or sometimes see last night's tape, or see this, and then go back and see last night's tape, or perhaps send out after a pizza. But I'm going to take some of the verbal maps that we used last night, and I am almost going to pretend that we didn't do it. You got that, right? I'm going to use some of the same terminology, some of the same kind of verbal maps, and for a little bit, until we all change our minds, sort of pretend that what we talked about last night, we didn't talk about. Now, it won't confuse anyone, will it? Except those who have any propensity at all to be confused. And just to check that, is anyone here alive? Don't be embarrassed. So here we went. It's still, until we change our mind along the way today, still sort of on the basis of that great area of acts and facts. Try not to get confused, because I repeat, for those of you that saw last night's tape or that were here last night, we're sort of pretending that last night didn't exist. In other words, it's like the first time we're going to talk about acts and facts. Now, some of the things. First, let's say something again. Let's say something in the beginning. See, remember, you're supposed to pretend if you saw last night that it didn't happen. Or if it did happen, try this, make it even stickier. That we did meet last night, but we talked about something completely different than whatever you thought I talked about. How about that? Whichever way you find it easier. Either play like to imagine that we didn't meet last night, or if that's difficult, which I'm not going to question, it can be, then pretend. Of course, you don't have to pretend. We did meet last night, but pretend that what you think that we talked about last night, we didn't. Now we're straight. All right, I was going to talk today a little bit and get you to try and look about the world of acts and facts. And first off, a little something about facts. These are the apparent reasons that make men take certain actions. But the tricky part is, and of course, any sane man, if you ask them why they did something, they will give you a fact. They don't have to call it, but just remember you're using the terms acts and facts in the broadest possible connotation, so I don't have to keep coming up with what would amount to snow cone variations of it. Just keep shaving it down, but just consider it's acts and facts. So facts are the apparent reasons that men take certain actions, but they always follow whatever the need was that made them act. So until a man acts, in the truest sense of the word, until somebody acts, there are no facts. This, of course, has almost no pertinence. It has no practical pertinence in the ordinary world, because if an ordinary mind heard this, they'd want to wrestle about something probably along the lines of starting with that word I know many of you just despise. It's the big L. Somebody wants to speak to you about logic, which right away, if you're going to deal in logic, you might as well forget Kitty Hawk. It's like Kitty Hawk never existed. You drive through the Piedmont area of North Carolina, you drive out toward the ocean, and you got your choice. Either the ocean is not there, or between wherever you left and looking for Kitty Hawk, you'll be up to your hubcaps in water. You follow? There are no facts until a man acts. But now back at the North Carolina level, at city level, this, of course, is not true three-dimensionally. And you can't look to try and see that what I'm saying in some way refutes ordinary logic. It's not true. Those people who are most sane in the ordinary world, if they're going to go about something, I'm talking about the most sane, not just ordinary people that get through life, but the thinkers, the technicians, the scientists. What do they do before they act? Anybody knows. Well, you give it some thought. I mean, the Wright brothers, for instance, is who I know you guys were inferring about North Carolina. The Wright brothers didn't go out and fly an airplane back in 19, whatever it was, 02, and then come back inside and sit down, and Wilbur say, Orville, what do you think we just did? And Orville said, I was about to ask you, what in the hell was that? And yet, if you can hear beyond the ordinary level of human existence here, that is exactly what seems to take place. At the higher levels you get to, that is called intelligence, scientific, rational, and we're not here to refute that because that's the way it's supposed to be. But they take it on that basis that, wait, they did not go out and fly, these guys, until they sit down. As struggling and as nascent an undertaking as that technology was, kind of hit and miss and move in the dark, they had to give some thought to it before it happened. I'm sure that they had a few miscalculations, but everything moves on the basis in the human realm. We're not talking about just the everyday life of woodpeckers and grubworms. Not intelligent folks like us. So before they actually move, Orville and Wilbur, of course, he had another brother they don't like for me to talk about, but they sat down and they gave it some thought. Well, you shouldn't laugh, sir. In fact, he looked a lot like, what's your name? By any reasonable recollection, anybody's history, by family archives, just by your own decent intelligence, you know damn well, or for those of you in the Bible Belt, you know darn well that they sat down and they gave some thought to what they're going to do. Can you hear the suspicion that should be lurking in your little gray cells? That until a man acts, there are no facts. Now, we could end up making the universe's largest snow cone. Shaved ice. We can keep shaving this, and I keep having, if we're doing it logically, which it sounds like we're doing when we're talking and making hand gestures, because there's nothing more logical, more satisfying to a good mind than hand gestures. They're good enough for the Pope, they're good enough for me. I always had my doubts what that meant, but who are we to question a man of God? If he looks at you and goes, you just hope for the best. Of course, that leads into other areas. Long before us, we've had people that wrote down that they, as far as they and the gods were concerned, that they hoped for the best. Notice this, none of them are among us. At any rate, I was going to make some of this real hit and go by real fast. But I want you to consider that until a man acts, there are no facts, and yet everything in the ordinary operations of the intellect, it's not that it's wrong, everybody that passes for sane, this cannot be true. I guess they could think of something that would be true. I could make up an example that until a man acts, there are no facts. We could say the first guy who ever discovered a kumquat, let us say that he was out lurking around outside his vineyard, out near the kudzu, and he looked down and he found the first man, I shudder to think about it, but the first man who ever personally came into the presence of a kumquat. I mean, it's bad enough they had to look at it and realize what its name was. But the man who found it. Now, you could say in a small way that the fact preceded, or that the act preceded the fact. That is, he discovered this thing and thought, what is that? And somewhere along the line, I don't even want to, for a second, try and imagine why somebody came up with the name kumquat. Not me. But at any rate, so he looks at it and he thinks, I've never seen anything like it, and let us say that he was well versed enough in fruits and general gardening and husbandry of the earth that he thought, nobody's ever seen this and I can call it anything I want to. That he put a fact to it. But now other than that, and that would be forgotten, if I must do it for you, it'd be forgotten almost immediately, because it's not necessary in life to see that there's any sort of sequence between acts and facts. And so it seems, and the more that you are intelligent, which about runs and covers the majority of this planet now, it would seem as though that we're now thinking and planning, setting up paradigms, theories, speculating how things might work, scientific investigations, and then seeing if the facts will come along and marshal themselves in such a way as to fit in. And that passes for being very intelligent. And in the city it is. But the sly part is that until a man acts, there are no facts. And this would not be, I'm not sure, looking upon your bright little faces, how much success we're going to have on this gloomy Saturday. But you could take the world's most intelligent person, scientist, psychologist, philosopher, and present them with that sentence. And may I offer my own theory? It will not fly. The sentence makes sense, doesn't it? That until a man acts, there are no facts. And maybe I could get a man here and there for a few seconds to take that in some sort of, at best he might say, well, that's some sort of metaphysical, philosophical paradigm that has no real significance. That the sentence sort of makes sense, but no one could see that it has validity right at the heart of everyday existence. That until a man acts, there are no facts. It even appears, as I said, the more you are dealing with what passes for the ordinary, scientific, sophisticated, cosmopolitan world, it would appear to be almost the opposite now. Because the more you're living in a technologically complex society as we are, driving cars, running cameras, wearing synthetic clothes, eating foods that men almost conjure up 2 or 3 stages from the earth, that it seems to be more and more some sort of existence is at least 1 or 2 steps removed from a barbaric, hand-to-mouth, physical, feral existence. And yet, it's not that 1 or 2, one or the other, is the exact description and proper mapping of what's going on. But the part that is impossible for ordinary intelligence to see, inasmuch as it has grown and was nurtured in one of these pastures that we've just mentioned, it's impossible for it to directly see. But until a man acts, until the ordinary, non-verbal, non-plotted, non-intellectual in the strictest sense of it, until that happens, that is, until man acts, there are no facts. But the more you're into reasonable, sophisticated, civilized, contemporary society, it would appear to be, as much as possible, the opposite. Now, not completely, because there are all sorts of minor things that even a bricklayer or an atomic physicist, let us say, in the Western world does not sit down and come up with a theory as to how to tie his shoes once he gets them on. And of course, assuming they have laces. I don't want to picture a man wearing slip-ons sitting there all afternoon trying to tie his shoes. But the more you're living in a contemporary world, not just outside, but that nowadays it's inescapable that there's a nexus, but you are living in a complex world here. If you present to yourself or to someone else that until a man acts, there are no facts, probably the most charitable reaction would be that it's almost a non sequitur, and perhaps you've been drinking or you've been out in the sun too long, that is just no longer true. It cannot be in any way proven. It can hardly be tolerated by an ordinary, educated, sophisticated 1991 intellect. Because contraire, it would say, it would not have to be a brain surgeon, an atomic physicist to say this, that they would say, well, nowadays, life is run more and more almost on a catch-up basis of men having theories, about how things should be done, speculative ideas about how to improve the technology, all the way from automobiles to clothing and etc., and that these come first, that we've got facts going on before we have acts going on. Because we certainly wouldn't have sat down. I can disprove, or I can take their side immediately and say we would have not sat down. People with college educations that bathe and shave and take good care of themselves would not be meeting in these large areas like in Florida and Texas and planning these big old rockets that cost a lot of money and can blow up and really hurt you. They would not do this. They would not act and try and send up a rocket until they had what? First, strongly swam into the sea of facts. That is the theory. They had to come up with the theory of how jet propulsion works, the theories and trigonometry of projectiles, and how to aim these rockets. I mean, who's going to say otherwise? It's insanity to say otherwise. Well, this is Saturday, and most of the booby hatches are closed. So, you want to take a chance? Unless you see any spies in our midst. Until man acts, there are no facts. This cannot in any way, even somebody with your stringent and iron-jawed intelligence cannot prove that. It cannot be proven. It's not simply logical. If you looked at the front parlor as being logical and the back kitchen door is illogical, this sort of thing, I even hesitate to say it's in the backyard. It's down the road, because you cannot prove it, you cannot disprove it. But to say that until a man acts there are no facts flies absolutely by every ordinary alternating current that drives the human nervous system and the brain. It flies in the face in a way that's singular, in the face of logic. That is, in the face of an on and off switch. It's information that you're saying, well, it's not either on or off. We're saying, if you're looking at it as being positive or negative runs of electricity, and saying, all right, it's in the wire there. We're somewhere in that neighborhood. We're talking about the same general thing, but it's neither one of those. But based upon the way the brain ordinarily operates, until a man acts, there are no facts, and the more that you are in the civilized, sophisticated, educated world in which we all are now, if that has any validity, if there is any useful information in that sentence, it would be just the opposite. It has got to be. Even I cannot prove what I just said to ordinary people. If that comes as a surprise. Nowadays, the more you are living under the auspices of the talking end of the intellect, of the nervous system, the more this sentence almost gives new meaning to the term non sequitur. Because nowadays, it appears to be just the opposite. That apparently, if I'd been listening to myself for the last few minutes, well, I was, okay. Now I can say, well, just the kinds of things that you pointed out, the kinds of example you took of rocket travel, the need to know at least a smidgen, a modicum about trigonometry, to build the vehicles that you're sending out, something about metallurgy, that there had to be thought, there had to be thinking, there had to be facts known, used, before the act of sending off a rocket took place. Anybody would say otherwise is what? Welcome here. No, an idiot. They gotta be. It's insanity. You're going to say, now I'm speaking, you're going to say that men, for instance, sent off rockets into space, whoever the first one was, the Russians or the Americans, whoever sent out the first rocket, let's say the first manned rocket, and got people out of the gravitational field of the planet. Are you telling me that they did that, and in some way then they came up with a theory that made it work? You're not going to make me answer that, are you? Even though I think that most of the booby and bobby hatches are closed this time on Saturday, I personally don't want to run the risk. of responding to that in a face-to-face manner. It cannot be true, correct? I mean, there is no way that can be true. That they sent off the first rocket, manned rocket, knew all the trigger. Anyway, just take this. Let me not drag in any of the intellectual fodder that might distract you, because it's interesting enough to see just the blatant insanity of it to start with. I'm still doing the dialogue for me and the rest of the world. You're saying that they sent out a rocket with everything involved. Don't go into details, I told you that. All right, but they sent off a manned rocket. They sent it off, and then they came up with a theory about how it worked. Now, you put it that way, and I don't like to answer just on the off chance that all of the asylums are not closed this time on Saturday. It can't be true, right? Well, do not bet your mother's brooch on it. Until man acts. Now, you got the arbitrarily right quick, and all of you can do this, but now you got to separate man from everything else. Let's just take on our planet. The man is obviously, by anybody's observation on this planet, singular in this part of the nervous system, going into the frontal lobes and the talking part, that he is unique on the planet. We can all agree to that, surely. And that very thing that now talks is the very thing that cannot see and will, for very good reasons, deny, if it would stoop so low as to even engage in this debate, deny the fact of me saying until a man acts, there are no facts. Because an intellect, if it would waste its time putting up with this sort of hard scrabble verbiage, might say, well, all right, if you're going to talk about stuff like you could just be walking along and reach down and pick up a rock, and so you did it without thinking. Or maybe you picked up a rock and it was hot, and then you thought, well, I should have known better. It was laying there close to that tar, and it's 95 degrees. It's not exceptions. It's not some sort of little ephemeral incident. This is not an anecdotally based law of physics. Until a man acts, there are no facts. And there is no way that the intellect, the cerebral cortex of man operating on the AC current that runs it, can ever see that. You can't even turn it backwards. It would not even appeal to a first-rate maniac. Just somebody deranged in the ordinary description, use of that term. It's worse than that. It does not compute. But it is a fact that until a man acts, there are no facts. And everything that would seem to be the structure, the underpinning of everyone's intellect at the ordinary level, all of your education, common sense, just sitting around thinking who you are and what you're going to do next and what's happened to you, says that this is probably too insane to even grace with a decent description of being insane. It's something that makes insanity look good. It's beyond the pale, the intellectual pale. And yet, once you get a glimpse of it, there's no argument. It's not a debate. It's not a theory. It's a fact. Of course, it's not a fact because facts are subject to be what? Unfacted, reversed. And when information starts getting at the edge, the boundary of whatever the dimensional structures, let's say in this case, let's just call it three-dimensional. When it starts getting to the edge of the three-dimensional, it cannot be proven. It can't be disproven. And just even talk about it, if somebody knows what's right around the edge, or if we're going to be really magnanimous, well, I resent that because I used to be a civitan, but if we're really going to be magnanimous and it gets out to the edge, we could say four-dimensionally, we got a brain operating. So if you want to do that, then consider it's getting, but see, 4 dimensions, I cannot spatially make a thing. If we're talking about 3-dimensional, we can imagine this cube floating out there, and that everybody can see that you can be conscious 3-dimensionally. Just the spatial reality of here we are. And so you can imagine this cube floating there. Which, when you go further and I start saying, well, another dimension, you can't draw it. Mathematically, I know they can come up with paradigms of it. but you cannot picture a four-dimensional cube. You can take the good high school way out and say, all right, the fourth dimension is like time, so we imagine the cube just floating there, and then we have to see what time it is, and now we got 4 dimensions. All right, if you're going to give me that kind of crap, 5 dimensions. Now work on that. You've got to picture that anything that would resemble real facts to explain what's going on has got to get outside the limit that the facts seem to explain things therein. I guess I should be thankful that some people even heard that the way it came out. Put it to you another way. If you're going to understand it, if we're going to call this, for a second, let's say a four-dimensional existence. If you're going to ever understand a four-dimensional existence, the paradigm, the absolute, all-encompassing, greatest, not from my definition, anybody's, the absolute, definitive description of a four-dimensional universe explains nothing. Because if that could happen, which it does not normally do, but if you could, at any ordinary level, if just an ordinary person's intellect could through the electrical, chemical operations of it, run up to the edge of understanding everything about itself, if we consider it's going to be four-dimensional existence, and it saw all of that, in a sense it would be equal to understanding nothing. I can without any trouble, I'm sure. Just as fast as I can talk, think up a little parable that most of you go, oh, yeah. But you should be able to do that yourself. Can't you? If everything, whatever, and it doesn't have to be, there's no magic about the fourth dimension. If I said the third dimension, if I cut out the idea of this cube floating out there, if we just said, all right, 3 dimensions is where we live. If you understood everything about 3 dimensions, you wouldn't understand anything. You've got to get at least 1 inch, 1 silly millimeter. You've got to get some movement away from the limits of where that perception was nourished, just an iota. You've got to get that far away to have what would begin to be real understanding of what it is. But still at that level, it is impossible to see in any way that there could be any discussion regarding the fact of how acts succeed facts. All right? Okay. Try it this way. Until there is some human action of some nature, human action, that is, it has this thing going and talking. Until there is some action, no one knows the facts. Put it in big old quotation marks. I don't care what the fact says. I don't care what the action is, whether it's academic, whatever it is. But until some action is taken, no one knows the facts involved, because the facts do not exist except subsequent to the acts. And yet within the three-dimensional or four-dimensional, if you want to push it, if you can do it, it doesn't make any difference. When you get into the perimeters, the confines of ordinary, let's even say four-dimensional awareness, all the facts that exist that come into play are four-dimensional facts at best. And many times they're not four-dimensional facts. And they're less than that is what normally goes by such things as stupidity, dangerous prejudice, one-sidedness, ignorance. Would be like people saying, well, there's no decent religion except being a Baptist. Anybody that's not a Baptist, if I had my way, I'm sure God would be pleased with me if I could kill them all. If people wouldn't bother me or want to lock me up and give me a bunch of grief. I'd just kill everybody because I know that'd be the best thing. Within the confines of a three- or four-dimensional existence, you could say, well, that's pretty crude. And it is pretty crude, and I certainly would not want to live next to such a person. Not even being a Baptist. I just wouldn't want all the blood and the aggravation in my neighborhood. And I'm sure you would agree. But there is no great, in some way, metaphysical lesson to be learned from that, because there is, from a view outside the third or fourth dimension, beyond that, even those that appear to be tolerant within those dimensions. That is, someone who would stand up and say, well, wait a minute, don't everybody pick on this guy who's so prejudiced. He has a very poor education. He came from a very deprived background. He grew up eating cream of wheat and nothing else. He probably has neural problems somewhere. And so this person would pass as being more developed, more sophisticated, more educated, and yet there is no real operational difference. Neither one of them, if a person appears to be non-educated, extremely prejudiced, extremely narrow-minded, they do not know any more insofar as the world of acts v. facts. They do not know any more than someone that would appear to be more sophisticated, more broad-minded in their view. Now, at the ordinary city level, it appears to, as it's supposed to. That's part of the continuing cry in support of education. It's part of the continuing so-called belief that much of crime, prejudice, mistreatment of children, women, and good-looking men, that much of this would be abated, if not outright cured, with what? More education. That if men had more facts, that there would be less intolerable, less annoying, less dangerous acts. And once you get outside the limits of wherever the ordinary intellect is operating, whatever you can take, third or fourth dimensions, outside of that, this has no validity. It's not right or wrong. It simply has no validity, because you would be flying out then to the edge if you want to picture it again in 3 dimensions, so we can make a spatial picture of it, and I can make another hand gesture and get some exercise. But this cube floating out there, instead of you considering the cube to be a paradigm for the planet Earth, paradigm for human intelligence, it's floating out there with the 3 dimensions. You can understand everything about that cube, and it would be tantamount to shutting down the intelligence, because then you would have nowhere else to go, an ordinary person. You could say then, if this was theoretically possible, that you knew all the facts involved with a 3-dimensional existence. But if you could reach that saturation point, which you people cannot, but if you could, do you understand that it would be tantamount to becoming blank all over? You would be rendered, in a sense, impotent. That you would understand everything and you would understand nothing. Or you would understand that everything is nothing. Or you would understand that nothing is everything. Or you would understand that everything is just like it has to be, and then you'd understand, including me thinking that. Which, wait a minute, changes it. No, it doesn't, because if that's what I must think, then it doesn't change it. And you can get very confused, maybe take up drinking, or, if worse comes to worse, begin to teach at a college level. Don't anybody write me. Take your cheap shot at somebody else. Become a rabbi, a truck driver. Or think, to hell with it, I'll just become a parent. Did we spread the insults around enough? All right. I hate getting nasty postcards and letters just from one group. Facts follow acts. It cannot be otherwise, but the intellect cannot see that, can never see that at the ordinary level, because why? I was afraid he'd ask that. Because the development of the human intellect, no matter where you went to school, no matter whether you went to a state college, no matter whether you flunked out of Montessori, wherever you went, the education, and I say education in the broadest sense of the word, everything, the food that made this operate, cannot perceive of that. I mean, if you talk to the ordinary intellect, you can do it to yourself, and you say to the ordinary intellect, facts always follow acts. And here it goes, if you hadn't got it already, and it goes, all right, wait a minute, let me think about that. Well, I was hoping for a little better, but it's a good thing that hope doesn't cost money, does it? All right, I didn't want to because I like facts via acts. Let me try it this way then. Facts follow reality. Now, that's getting kind of cheap, but what the hell? Most of us got on cheap clothes, cheap hair. And we're not even going into what reality is. All you got to do is take the maps of reality, the descriptions, the theories, the beliefs, the sanity, the perceptions. Take that, and if you got anything left over, you can call the rest of it reality. There is no way for the intellect, no one started off on the wrong foot. There is no way that the intellect can start with the facts. And there is no way that the ordinary intellect can start with the acts. That is separate. The intellect to look upon something, for it to serve the function it has served, to transform and transfer energy. It looks upon something, let us say a fact. And let's assume we don't know what the hell it is. It just looks upon a fact. A fact would be a hippopotamus. If you want to try this right quick, it's you and a hippo are standing on a street corner, and an orange bus with feathers on top of it, emanating sounds that sounds somewhat like a James Brown tape being played backward. It goes by, and you and the hippo both, for whatever reason, we're not going to yet, you and the hippo both, it catches your attention. We're operating on the assumption that the hippopotamus does not have a thinking intellect, since they have never seen fit to communicate with men. And don't everybody make your own cheap joke like, well, maybe they're too smart. You know, I already had Kyruk do one of them, if you don't recall. The version was that men used to talk to trees until they found how dumb they were. And then men decided not to waste their intellectual time. So don't imagine that hippos, don't imagine that they just are condescending. So there's no way for us to get into a hippo mind, because the hippo does not have a mind like we're talking about. But the colors, everything that I described, the bus went by, and you and the hippo went. And then it gets out of spatial, it gets out of nervous system range, perceived importance by the hippo. And so then the hippo either looks around at something else or at nothing. Who knows what? I'm not going to try to go in the mind of a hippo. No, I won't. But what does a human do? The event took place, and then what? The human would want to say to the hippo, or somebody, did you see that? Or if nothing else, the human thinks about what happened. Thinks about, is anybody going to believe this? I can start talking. It doesn't matter what. It thinks something, which is a transformation of energy. It thinks of something about that bus, the sight it just saw. Whatever it thinks about becomes a matter of facts following acts, except the part that you cannot deal with any better than we are right now, is that acts would not exist were it not for facts. Now the bus actually went by, and if you need me to do it, I can extract what would seem to be the human element in this and say it's you standing there in your primeval glory, nude, Well, thank God I hadn't seen most of you nude, so I'll just say it theoretically in your primeval glory nude. It's you and the hippo standing there on a riverbank, and an alligator on fire goes by. Let's say that. A natural phenomenon. Well, as opposed to a bus, I mean. All right, skip the fire then. An alligator goes by. You and the hippo see the alligator go by. What are you going to say about it? The hippo, the activity, call it anything you want to, the movement in the water, you and the hippo went. But after that, what? We can say, to get you started, that facts always follow acts. That something happens in the human intellect if it talks. If you're dealing with a person who has that part of the intellect operating and it talks, it puts a name on it and it can talk about it. And so you can say that facts follow acts. But that is almost kindergarten. Because it's not like that acts produce facts. Now, the obvious part is to say, all right, a hippo saw the same thing you did, but the hippo didn't certainly say, oh my God, I've got to get my intellect to the point that it can talk so I can put a name on this. It's not that. And so you can just blame it back on this level. You can say, well, it's human destiny that men must talk and to operate the world, which is true. We're not debating that. To operate the world as it is, men must be able to name things and they must be able to put facts to acts. Or there'd be no science, there'd be no education, we wouldn't be staying here, we would not be civilized, etc. You could not even speak. Or if you could speak, it would be no more than sound, because no one would ever make facts out of the acts of making sound. That is, that a group of people, let's say we're all English speaking, it would never gotten to the point of somebody coming up with a new something called paper. Paper, and everybody, paper, and then paper. And so from then on, every time you want to communicate something about paper, you say paper, you make a sound, and other people speak your language, go paper. So apparently, that there is some relationship between acts and facts. If you can see beyond the three-dimensional, the city level, it's not that that's wrong, it's moot. If you can get to the point of seeing that, it would be like understanding everything in the third dimension. And it just all becomes irrelevant. It's not a matter of arguing that this is true or it's not true. If you see everything as being, let's say you had a little box. Somebody had a little box. You found a little box. Somebody was struggling to hold on and guard a little box, and you got it and you looked at it. And we don't know what other people thought they saw or other people they'd looked at before, but you looked in the little box, you got good eyesight, as far as anybody knows in the three-dimensional world. And you look in the box, there's no secrets, it's just a little box. And you open it up and you look, and there's nothing in there. What can be added to that? I don't mean physically, but if you look and that's it, now you can lay it aside and somebody say, well, I have a theory about that. But did you or did you not look in the box and see everything in the box? Of course, we're saying there was nothing in the box, but that's something. You looked and you saw the nature of the box. That would be if you saw everything available about three-dimensional existence, if that's what we're talking about. And after that, it's no longer a matter of right or wrong. There's no good word for it. Maybe if we took moot and cubed it. That's about the best I can do. Or maybe irrelevance cubed minus any possible hostility. How about that for an equation? So it is somewhat misleading to even say that facts follow acts, but at the three-dimensional level, that is absolutely correct. The people do not make up facts that are not in pursuit of some act. And this is true even if you think that somebody is sitting around dealing in the world of mathematical theorems. Facts follow acts, except the three-dimensional. The ordinary intelligence cannot see that, because it will say, wait a minute, I can theorize something that's never happened. And then you've been had. You've been proven wrong again. I mean, don't stay around and try to argue. They got you. A kid can do that to you. And yet it's not true. It's not operationally correct. Because all that would do, if one person could pursue that far enough for a whole lifetime, all they would have done is now know, be completely operationally familiar with every square inch on every side of a block. And as I said, if you could reach that point, it would be like almost electrochemical saturation. It would be almost as though you're back to a blank. Not true, but there's no way to describe this because it does not happen. But you understand, it would be as though you knew everything possible about this little box you looked in. That in some way that you were led to believe, that you thought, if I could ever get hold of that secret box I know that somebody's got, and looked in there and could see it for myself, nobody'd bug me for a second, I'd know everything. Let's say that there is such a box you got, and you looked in there, and it's absolutely empty. And so now you know everything about that box. What are you going to do after that? Many of you who are having to recall them, this is the basis of many, 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 many fairy tales, legends, religious stories, except they're not near that direct, and they're not near that disappointing. If you could play both games, if you could look at a three-dimensional paradigm with a four-dimensional nervous system. But that's what it would be comparable to. And so in a sense, your nervous system, the thinking end, would have been shut down. Or if you want another way, it's as though you had learned everything there was to know in the three-dimensional world. Or put another way, it's like you finally ate the world's largest meal, not just the world's largest meal, but it was a permanent meal. That you got it and you ate it and that was it. So imagine you're going to live another 40 years, let's say, and then you have to look back and think of all the time, all the energy, all the enjoyment, all the complaints, just all the general activity involved with eating, and so you suddenly are aware of the fact, I'll never eat again. This is the one part of life that's gone. That is not a perfect paradigm. But that would be what it would be if a man could understand at the ordinary level that all facts follow acts, and it's impossible to see it. And if you could see it, it would be as though you reached into a man's brain, an ordinary man, which thankfully you cannot. I don't even like to think, but so you reached in like a sock, grabbed the toe from the inside, and you pulled it inside out. That's not the world's greatest paradigm that I just did. But I'll leave it at this. What would that prove? That's confusing enough. Everybody write that down. What would that prove? Just because you could reach in a guy's brain and grab it like the toe of a sock and pull it inside out and go, there, and then you left. I don't know, come think about it. Why not? You could start a religion on that. Did we succeed in anyone even having any idea that we're talking about the same thing we were talking about last night? And I told you to pretend that we're going to change it. Didn't take much pretension, did it? But let me just give you some, before we run out. Some torted corollaries of today, or those of you that would not listen to reason, those of you that think that we actually talked about something like this last night, it's your problem. But consider between what we didn't talk about last night and then what we're talking about today. Consider some of these. See if you can, I shouldn't say make them fit. Perhaps you'd like to just write them down or remember them, or perhaps you wouldn't. The mind of man does not invent facts. Acts do. I guess we could stop there. I hate to say this because it's going to get some kind of chuckle. That's a fact. Right? It's like acts are a form of strange parents who cannot themselves actually become viable until they produce progeny. Yeah, that's what I meant to say. We may all live to regret it, but... and of course, those of you who've been around, you surely know by now I did not conjure up that sentence just for the sake of sounding paradoxical, but that is when you're dealing with the confines of anything, a three-dimensional existence, which language, or four-dimension if you want to push it, it doesn't matter, but that language is dealing with, then acts, remember we start out talking about acts and facts, that acts would be like parents. That cannot become themselves actually, in any sense of the word, active until they have produced some offspring. And that's not just for the sake of making up an absolutely paradoxical statement. It's like saying your parents can't exist until they had you. It is not that strange because some of you just 30 or 40 minutes ago were seeing the edge of this. It's not that the opposite's true. It's not some little cheap shot of saying that children produce their parents, or that parents do not exist in some science fiction-y way until they have actually had children. That in some way that's a metaphor, or you don't actually exist until you have produced your own offspring to carry on your genetic line. No, it's not that. You could make some sort of parable out of that. It is not that. It is more literal, except, of course, it is completely, and I'll admit it, it has overstepped any bounds of reason and propriety of how the intellect thinks. But acts in the do-si-do of acts and facts. Acts are like parents who cannot actually exist. They are not viable. They do not operate at this level until they have offsprings. No one sees any connection between this and starting out about the great dance between acts and facts. May I make a suggestion? Why not? I'm afraid it's not the most original song in the world, but at least you cannot plagiarize yourself. If you get a glimpse of this, the name of the song is coming up, you've heard it before, but if you get a glimpse of this, may I suggest, could I have a G? May I suggest, it sure will explain a lot. Do you want a coda to this song? Not to ordinary people, but it sure will explain a lot. And even I, being the author of that particular little ditty, in all humility, must admit that even the description of the tentative title is not begin to cover it, to say it explains a lot. It explains everything. Not just because I said it, but it is being able to understand that everything that's possible to be known within the confines of one area, everything that can be known three-dimensionally or four-dimensionally, once it is known, it is irrelevant. It doesn't tell you anything. It would be like working all of your life to get through this door. And I'm not trying to give you the blues, but so what? Of course, everybody dreams, so what? Let me get there, because I just know it's going to be some sort of metaphysical, spiritual, intellectually explosive experience. I'm going to tell you what it is. And you can get taste of this. It is not, you don't have to take it in some theoretical, completely theoretical, metaphysical way, because you've been through it in life. In life, it's normally ignored. In life, if it's pointed out, people consider it as being some sort of faux pas on their part. It's like achieving something. This is not a perfect parallel, but there is validity or I wouldn't bring it up. It's like struggling real hard to get something. Working night and day to put yourself through school, to get your diploma in animal husbandry before you find out what it actually meant. But never mind. In psychology, in chemistry. Or you work. If you don't have to look at it just this way. You work and you train so that you can run and win some race somewhere, or run the world's fastest mile, whatever it is. Everybody knows this now, in a certain way. Once you do that, once they give you your degree, after all these years working, 3 jobs, running your health, and they give you the degree, and you look at it, or you run the mile, and they say, that's it, and they take your picture, and they shake your hand, they hand you a thing, you do understand, I think in life it's known as a letdown. It's not a perfect parallel, but what I'm telling you, if you understood everything 3-dimensionally, it's not a pejorative comment when I say let down, but it would be more like, and there's no good term for this, but it would be closest to, well, now what? That you worked all of your life to understand what the hell's going on, and they let you through the door, or you get through the door. And you get through, and once you go through, by the way, it closes. Don't ask me, don't even worry about, well, if I start going through it, I'll hold it or stick my foot in it. No, you won't. You go through it, if you have run the world's fastest mile, what are you going to do for an encore? At least not one field. If you understand everything in the 3-dimensional world, that'd be the end of it. But the point that the ordinary intellect cannot make, since it can't get there, that is not some sort of weird parable I'm trying to make up to say, well, if a man understood everything, it'd ruin him. Because there are little fairy tales about that, as all of you should know. The one for children is King Midas. But all you got to do is take that a bit allegorically instead of him, everything he touched that he thought he liked, it literally turned it into gold. It would be like just understanding so much that life would lose all meaning to you. And that's the way that's the best they can come up with fairy tales in ordinary life. Well, it's a good thing a man does not have the wisdom of the gods, or it'd ruin him. It'd be like flying too close to the sun, and indeed, his metaphorical, intellectual wax wings would melt, and he'd just be ruined. That's Southern philosophical talk. He would crash to the earth and be ruined, and probably get his clothes all dirty, and his mama whoop him. It's more than that, and it's less than that. You can't do it, but if you could, it wouldn't be that you would necessarily fall to the earth, or that you'd be the King Midas. Touched his son and ruined it. Of course, I always had a better version than the king touching his son. I always imagined that the king had to go relieve himself and said, I'll be back in a second. And rather than he touched his kid before he knew it, I always had my own version of the king going, oh my God. Since we ran out of tape, I think we'll just, as some of you like to call it, we'll just AS. Arbitrarily stop.